The Adeptus Mechanicus hold a near-monopoly on artifice and production of mechanical material within the Imperium of Man. Machinery, weapons of war, transport, the works. That said, the organisation we see today is but a remnant of perhaps the largest interstellar human empire that isn't the Imperium, the Martian Mechanicum, who had holdings all over the place. Though the Mechanicum no longer exists as an independent entity despite its claims of a measure of autonomy, these worlds remain as bastions of the cult Mechanicus, the only sources of advanced weapons and equipment left in the Imperium. They contain vast populations and are all but entirely given over to industry. They are the Phi-class planets of the Imperium, known more commonly as Forge Worlds. This is Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to 40k Stories. Forge World is the catch-all term for a planet held by the Adeptus Mechanicus, and they certainly live up to their name. They are planets which are devoted to production, industry, and the forging of all things mechanical, along with the veneration of the machine god. Many of them have been held by the forces of Mars for millennia, and they are not exactly stable in terms of the buildings and forges upon them. Over the years, more and more space on Forge Worlds have been given over to the seemingly endless manufactorums, forges, factories and facilities of the Mechanicus, all of which work tirelessly and callously to create the material demanded by the Mechanicus and the Imperium. Interestingly, though there is a heavy amount of automation and machine-based crafting involved in the operation of a Forge World, the main workforce of the planet is still human, most of whom will probably unaugmented, I suspect, even though they serve the Martian priesthood. And said workforce is vast. Not incalculable, these aren't hive worlds like Necromunda, but still pretty large, running often into the billions. Actually, maybe it isn't so high now that I stop and think about it. However, the workforce isn't just crammed into factories and whatnot, as many Forge Worlds also contain massive mining operations. After all, the resources used in said factorums have to come from somewhere, and the demands of the Mechanicus means that waiting for off-world imports would be unreliable at best. Such is the scale of these operations, both in the mines and the factories, that even the natural features of the planet are not safe. Humans mastered terraforming millennia ago, and even if they are no longer able to shape the Earth to their will, or at least not at any reasonable speed, they can still drain entire oceans and maybe even level mountains just to make room for more facilities. Unsurprisingly, this means that the entire ecosystem of a typical Forge world is completely screwed up, with toxic atmospheres and rivers of sewage and waste and all that jazz. As far as we know, this is just the accepted norm on Forge Worlds. I haven't heard of them having environmental cleansing facilities per se, so those who live there are probably a hardy bunch anyway, even before counting the manual labour or any cybernetics they may have been granted. Whatever space isn't given over to production is probably reserved for either defence or for the accommodation and sustenance of the various peoples who inhabit the planet. Obviously, this means hub centres for the large civilian population, as well as potentially the odd food processor or water treatment plant. Though, given this is an organisation that generally doesn't see much value in the human form, they're probably not much more than the absolute basics. We've seen that the Mechanicus and the Imperium do employ slavery, and there's always imports from other worlds if you need it. However, every Forge World presumably also has a standing military presence on it, beyond what a planetary defence force might be expected to be. After all, the Adeptus Mechanicus has a broad range of military assets all of its own to call upon, and since their worlds are all Forge Worlds, it makes sense that said assets are based on those planets. The most numerous of these are the Skitari or Skitarii, depending on how you like to pronounce it, the mechanically enhanced cyborgs that make up the basic infantry, as well as smaller groups such as the constructs of the Legio Cybernetica that once bordered on AI, and of course the biggest Imperial war machines of all, the Titan Legions. The God Machines are both built and housed on Forge Worlds, and many Forge Worlds will have their own individual Titan Legion in the same way that a different class of world might have regiments for the Astra Militarum. Granted, it's only a handful of Titans as opposed to millions of infantry or tanks, but you get the rough idea. These forces will defend their forge world should they be around or nearby if it comes under assault, but they will also be used in the armies of the Mechanicus further afield, or even join an explorator fleet if its leader has either a high ranking on their world or has pulled some political strings. I don't believe there are two separate forces for defense and offense, certainly not for the Titans since they're already rare enough as it is, but I may have that one wrong. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the size of the galaxy and the occasional innovative traits of the Adeptus Mechanicus, there is some discrepancy from Forge World to Forge World in many areas. Obviously, they don't all produce the same things, different regions have different needs, both technological and military, but even when they are producing the same things, there is no universal exact pattern, despite the presence of STCs for basically everything. In fact, every Forge World has its own pattern for most things it produces, bringing a degree of non-standardization across the Imperium and even in individual armies if they're drawn from different regions. Due to this, there are actually certain patterns considered favourites in certain aspects by Imperial forces, whether it be the accuracy of a gun, the durability of a casing, or whatever else it may happen to be. Since there are so many of them, let's take a little time to explore some of the more famous Forge Worlds across the Imperium. The main one, to me, is the most important of them all, at least in the eyes of the Mechanicus itself, the red planet, Mars. Located right next to Terra in the Sol system, Mars was first terraformed and colonized supposedly as early as M3, becoming a hive world that existed alongside Earth as Terra was known back then, and functioning as a scientific powerhouse. However, the Age of Strife ripped the first human worlds apart due to the presence of warp storms, and as its defences fell, the populace of Mars turned to technology as their only hope for survival, as well as an object of veneration. The cult Mechanicus was born that day, and by the time of the Emperor's rise on Terra, the Martian Mechanicum was fully formed and independent, with Mars as its homeworld and power base for a wider empire. The two joined together soon after, working together ever since. But then there was that one time in the Horus Heresy where the Dark Mechanicum rose up and created a schism on Mars. The traitorous forces were able to cement a hold over the planet, forcing the Imperials to blockade Mars until many years after the Heresy's end, but after that, everything was fine. But then there was that one time that the fabricated generals politicking in the War of the Beast caused relations to break down and fire to be exchanged briefly between Astartes and Skitarii. But once the fabricated general realised that fighting the Imperium in the face of the largest orc invasion ever was completely idiotic, things were all fine on Mars. But then there was, you get the joke. There was one more civil war in M34, as the forces of the north and south of Mars went to war, but they were united by a common foe known as the Prophet of Cogs, who turned the millions of long-abandoned machines across the planet on both sides. The fact that this Prophet of Cogs presented such a threat should tell you just how much stuff, both junk and proper working machinery, has been cast off and dumped across Mars over the years. Interestingly, Mars is probably one of the few Forge worlds that isn't completely covered in factories and whatnot, possibly due to the Red Planet once being a hive world as well as the home of the cult Mechanicus. However, it is definitely not a hive world anymore, as it is covered in titanic forge temples that also function as hives to my best knowledge. Many more forges exist in orbit as part of the so-called Ring of Iron, pumping out huge amounts of large constructs and spacecraft that would presumably be too impractical to build on the surface. This orbital ring also houses the docks for Battlefleet Solar, the largest fleet in the entirety of the Imperium of Man. However, it is the other locations on the Martian surface that pique my interest more than even that. For example, there's the infamous Vaults of Moravec. I've mentioned this place before, as it was the place from which the scrap code was unleashed during the Schism of Mars by then fabricated General Kelbor Hal to overwhelm the loyalist Mechanicum. No one's quite sure what it contains, but its original creator, Primus Moravec, was part of a cult in the Mechanicum that sought to create a, and I loosely paraphrase, technological singularity that would create an artificial greater than human intelligence. Yeah, given the attitude toward AI in the Imperium and the Mechanicus after the Dark Age of technology and the whole Men of Iron fiasco, you understand why this guy was run out as a heretic and the vaults were ordered sealed by none other than the Emperor following the Treaty of Olympus that unified Terra and Mars. And speaking of Olympus, within Olympus Mons, Mars' largest mountain and site of its greatest forge temple run by the Fabricator General, there is the Temple of All Knowledge. It's kind of an arrogant name given the regression in humanity's technological intellect, but there you go. Its name in fact comes from the time when Mars was being blasted to ruin in the Age of Strife. Any technology was stored in the temple by the newly created tech priests both to presumably preserve and venerate it. Now it has wholly turned to a place of worship, though there were times in the Age of Strife when fragmented explorator fleet reports were stored there too. The temple was the site of a small uprising around the time of the Treaty of Olympus, as senior Magi realised that working with the Emperor would see their power usurped. No kidding. But it was put down in short order, and there were obviously anti-imperial revolts later, see the schism, but nothing that really took the temple to my knowledge. Interestingly, despite the place being known as the Temple of All Knowledge, if you actually want to find the collective knowledge of the Mechanicus, you'd be best served by looking elsewhere, for the place known as the High Altar of Technology. This is basically a gigantic database for everything the Mechanicus knows. Technology and discoveries are brought before it, and it is connected to every temple on Mars as well as every single forge world in the galaxy using a psychic servitor that is joined to all the other altars presumably on those worlds. I'm curious if this servitor is a lobotomized astropath since they're needed for long-range comms typically, as we've discussed before. Though there are other regions of fame, notably the famous forge temples from the Schism, there is one more Martian place I wish to mention, the Noctis Labyrinthus, or the Noctis Labyrinth, I've heard both. The place is completely abandoned by the forces of the Mechanicus even after all this time, mainly because there is a rumour that a Great Plague will kill any flesh or machine that enters its mines, and any who set up near it have found themselves affected with technical issues. This rumour, though, is a lie, to put a long story short, made to scare off the tech adepts from ever setting up shop there, and, whilst unconfirmed, the reason why is pretty simple if it's true. You see, it is believed that the Khitan known as the Void Dragon sleeps or is incarcerated within the Noctis Labyrinth, trapped there by the Emperor after he created the ancient Terran myth of St. George and the Dragon, so I'm led to believe. If this is true, it makes total sense to keep anything intelligent or sentient away from the vast chasms and valleys of the labyrinth, since Khitan are nothing if not innovative and manipulative, as we have also seen in the past. Before we move on from Mars, I just want to make a note of its population, 20 billion or so, as far as I know. Now, that isn't anything remarkable, you might say, it's just a number, and you'd be right. But compare that to Terra's population, which, whilst we lack accurate census data, is believed to run into the quadrillions. That means that for every person on Mars, there's about 1 million on Terra, just to put it into context. Now, I know that the Mechanicus probably doesn't allow that many people onto Mars who aren't part of the organisation, and I also know that Terra is a much more venerated holy site for the citizenry that sees mass pilgrimages every single day. But that ratio seems a little absurd to me. Humanity grows fast and is as tough as anything, so why is the Martian population so low, only 3 times the M3 Terran population? Since natural growth would probably see it be much larger than that by now, even after all the storms and rebellions and casualties at work. The number just seems small to my mind. Though Mars is the focal point of all Mechanicus knowledge and industry, there are many more famous and powerful forge worlds. In fact, you don't even need to go that far from Mars to find them. Jupiter, literally the next planet along in the Sol system, is classed as a forge world due to its vast orbital shipyards. It was over Jupiter that legendary vessels such as the Pride of the Emperor, flagship of the 3rd Legion Astartes, the Emperor's Children, was constructed in the Great Crusade. And whilst I suspect Mars handles a lot of the assembly work, Jupiter can still pull its weight, I believe. Staying with the legions, the ultramarine-controlled planets of Konor and the sort of homeworld of the Raven Guard Kievar are both forge worlds too, though Kievar seems to break a lot of the common tropes of Forge Worlds by still having forests and natural fauna. And staying with fleets, just like Mars in Segmentum Solar is both a Forge World and the base for the Segmentum's battle fleet, so Cypramundi is the home for Battlefleet Obscurus and Hydrafer is for Battlefleet Pacificus, as well as being Forge Worlds themselves. To be fair, it makes sense to use them. Why dock a fleet and base it around a planet if said planet doesn't have the production facilities on hand for repairs, construction, and resupply? Moving on to other famous Forge Worlds, one of the most intriguing to my mind is Styges 8 in Segmentum Pacificus's Vulcanus system, just outside of Segmentum Solar. This place is perhaps best known for its Leman-Russ Vanquisher and Manticore patterns, as it is one of very few places that can apparently build the Vanquisher, but it's not always been the safest of places. The original 2 Titan legions based on Styges 8, yes it had 2, the Legio Vulcanum 1 and 2, turned traitor in the Horus Heresy, and they travelled home following their betrayal to join a civilian/cultist uprising on the Forge World. Given there were 2 corrupted Titan legions coming after them, it is little surprise that Styges 8 couldn't hold alone. But they weren't alone. From nowhere, the Eldari of Craftworld's Saimhan arrived, saving the planet and deeply affecting the tech priests still loyal to the Imperium. Within their ranks, a secret order of sorts was founded, the Xenorites, advocates of the collection and use of Xenos technology for their own ends. Given the almost sacrosanct nature of STCs and the often heavy condemnation for those who think even slightly outside the box, assuming they're not called Belisarius Cole, it is no surprise that in the eyes of pretty much everyone in the Mechanicus and the Imperium, the Xenorites are offensive at best and heretics at worst. This doesn't stop or deter them at all, mind you, and the Xenorites continue to send out expeditions to gather technology for study. Unsurprisingly, the Xenos races they're taking the tech from will almost certainly object and fight back if they can, and the Inquisition and others in the Imperium are more than willing to do battle with the Xenorites too if needed. Again, this is no deterrent, it just sends the secrecy deeper and makes them harder to deal with. But despite the High Lords of Terra decreeing that Styges 8 was too valuable to interfere with, the Ordo Xenos of the Inquisition couldn't leave the planet alone, and deployed around a dozen Deathwatch kill teams to try and purge the place of the Xenorites. This war started in M36 and is believed to still be going on, with a lot of desperate moves being made on the side of the Xenorites, even infiltrating the records of the Administratum to try and scrub their charge sheet clean. Some of them have even gone hunting for the Black Library of the Eldari by breaching the webway, but whether there will be anything of consequence from that or their battles with the Deathwatch remains to be seen. On the other side of the galaxy to Styges 8 is another famous Forge World, though it is more famous for its geography than for its membership. This is Metallica, a world that has been extensively terraformed by the Mechanicus to be almost entirely metal. The atmosphere is lethal, no flora or fauna can survive. It was designed that way, an attempt to create the ideal world of the Cult Mechanicus ideology, and I suppose it was something of a success, something approved of by the wider organisation. It is home to the aptly named Legio Metallica Titan Legion, one of, if not the most successful Titan Legions of all time, even if there was a bit of a schism in there during the heresy. But interestingly, I couldn't find any particularly renowned patterns or designs associated with the place, which surprised me. Just like the Xenorites became a thing on Styges following a battle there, so Metallica has become a hub for certain individuals following a war. However, this one came much later. The Elucidan Schism was in 923 M39, and saw the 2 major factions of electro-priests come to blows. These are tech priests obsessed with the idea of the motive force, an aspect of the machine god that gives life and, well, motion to all things. To be fair, these 2 groups, the energy-draining Fulgurites and lightning-launching Corpuscarii, have fought near constantly in what are known as the Conduit Wars due to their opposing ideologies. But the Elucidan Schism was one of the more infamous flare-ups that was most viciously fought out on Metallica. The schism only truly ended around the time of the First Armageddon War, which wasn't for over a millennium, and the large amounts of fighting on Metallica meant that many Electro-priests were on the planet when the peace truce was declared, making it something of a hub for both groups ever since. Finally, I think it would be doing something of a disservice if I didn't at least mention the Forge World Ophelius 7, a name you might know, but you'd be forgiven for not knowing it's apparently a Forge World. After all, Ophelius 7 is a cardinal world, second in holiness only to Terra in terms of the Adeptus Mechanicum's faith in their god Emperor. I doubt it holds the same significance for many adepts of the machine god, but it might if they're fervent believers in the Omnissiah. Ophelius 7 had been conquered by the Imperial 5th Legion led personally by the Emperor, explaining its significance for those who venerate him as a deity, and for a time it actually became the base of operations for the entirety of the ecclesiarchy as an attempt for the organisation to get away from the Senatorum Imperialis, of whom the Fabricator General is a permanent member if you weren't aware. Though that all changed later as the base moved back to Terra and the secondary Synod Ministra was set up on Ophelia even later, it is still a valued and vital world for the Ministorum. Quite what the claim of the Mechanicus is on the planet I am unsure, as descriptions of the place do not speak of industry but rather of holy sites that cover it. But the construction of those things and the wealth that tempted the ecclesiarchy to base itself there will have needed a lot of resources that had to come from somewhere. My guess is that the Mechanicus were brought in during the early days of Ophelius 7's imperial rule to handle mining, industry and construction, since back then the cult of the ecclesiarchy wasn't really a thing. But whilst their forges were never decommissioned, they have become secondary to the endless shrines and whatnot, to the point people forget they're there. That's my best guess. And there you have it, a little insight into Forge Worlds, their operations, and a few famous ones to boot. These worlds are in many ways the backbone of the Imperium of Man, as their vast industry supplies both civilian and military missions the galaxy over. One wonders what they could have become had the Martian Mechanicum and the Terran Imperium not allied so deeply. Probably not much different now that I think about it. There'd still be a machine god, there just wouldn't quite be the same thing as an Omnissiah being the Emperor. Yeah, probably quite similar. Anyway, with that little foray done, it is time to move on. Since we've talked about all sorts of machines and technology in recent logs, I can't help but notice that one faction more mechanical than any other has been overlooked thus far. So next time, I think we'll look at the hierarchy and factions within that species, investigating the major groups known across the galaxy and some of their goals. For now, thank you for watching Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Goodbye.